Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: a man pleads guilty to running a Chinese police station in the heart of New York City. That one has been shut down, but a report says more are still active on U.S. soil. Authorities in New Jersey now permitted to use deadly force on drones that violate a new ban. The state just outlawed the aircraft in more than 20 cities, alongside a sharp uptick in mysterious sightings. The drone issue also making its way into this year's defense spending bill. If the drones are deemed a national risk, they face even more restrictions. And House Homeland Security Chair Mark Green says the China Initiative program may return after Donald Trump takes office, and cited a number of top China issues.
80% of cranes manufactured by one company from China. We discover now there are modems on these that can communicate what they see back to China, knowing exactly which military units and aircraft and tanks and jeeps are loaded on which ship. Well, now we know which ship to sink.
A Chinese man pled guilty Wednesday for opening and operating an illegal Chinese police station in Lower Manhattan. NTD's Jack Bradley brings us more.
Chen Jinping admitted to opening the police station, which was an illegal arm of China's Ministry of Public Security. It occupied an entire floor of an office building in Lower Manhattan's Chinatown. It closed in the fall of 2022, and on top of this, Chen admitted to destroying evidence of communications with an official in Fuzhou, China. The FBI has acknowledged that China has opened multiple police stations in the U.S. A 2022 report by Safeguard Defenders found that China uses these overseas police stations to track down, arrest, and extradite people wanted by the CCP, including dissidents of the regime. The Executive Assistant Director Robert Wells of the FBI's National Security Branch said in a statement Wednesday, quote, "Today's acknowledgement of guilt is a stark reminder of the insidious efforts taken by the PRC government to threaten, harass, and intimidate those who speak against their Communist Party. These blatant violations will not be tolerated on U.S. soil. The FBI remains committed to preserving the rights and freedoms of all people in our country and will defend against transnational repression at every front."
Safeguard Defenders says 5 more Chinese police outposts are still running on U.S. soil, located in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, Minneapolis, and Nebraska. Beijing operates a network of over 100 similar so-called overseas service stations in more than 50 foreign countries. Back to Chen Jinping, the man who pleaded guilty for running the New York outpost. He faces up to 5 years in prison. Chen is set to be sentenced next year. His co-defendant Lu Jianwang pleaded not guilty and is awaiting trial. A high-ranking FBI official called Chen's guilty plea a stark reminder of Beijing's efforts to threaten and harass those who speak out against the Chinese Communist Party. U.S. Assistant Attorney General Matthew Olsen said the U.S. would continue to pursue those that help with Beijing's transnational repression. Another alleged case of Chinese influence in the U.S. involves Linda's son, former aide to New York Governor Kathy Hochul, and former Governor Andrew Cuomo. Prosecutors accuse Son of acting as an agent for Beijing. That includes allegedly forging Hochul signatures on invitation letters to a Chinese delegation. The letter helped them secure visas to the U.S. According to prosecutors, Son influenced what Hochul said and didn't say. Son pleaded not guilty. Her attorney is looking to have the case dismissed. An update on the mystery drone sightings in New Jersey. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, is banning drone flying in more than 20 cities in the state. The ban will run through mid-January. The agency warned that authorities have the power to intercept any drones violating the order and are capable of using, quote, deadly force on them. In recent weeks, drone sightings across the state have seen a sharp uptick. It's unclear where the aircraft are coming from, and no one has admitted to owning them so far. The drone issue has even made its way into the U.S. defense spending bill for year 2025. The Senate passed the $895 billion budget on Wednesday with overwhelming support. The annual measure is called the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. The bill now awaits President Biden's signature to become law. It covers purchases of ships, aircraft, and weapons. It also has provisions to boost competitiveness with geopolitical rivals like China and Russia. As for how drones play into it, one of the hot topics in the bill addresses drones made in China, especially by two companies called DJI and Hochul. Congress has requested that a U.S. national security agency conducts a risk review of these drones. If they are deemed a risk to U.S. national security, they'll be placed on a blacklist, and new models will be prohibited from using FCC bandwidth for communications. That action wouldn't totally ban the drone, but would make it more difficult for them to operate. The bill also addresses strengthening the domestic supply chain for drones in the U.S. as well as allied countries. The U.S. Supreme Court decided on Wednesday to hear arguments from Chinese-owned app TikTok. The court hearing will happen on January 10th. It'll focus on national security and the law intended to force TikTok's Chinese parent company to sell the app by January 19th or face removal from U.S. app stores.
On Wednesday, the U.S. Supreme Court decided to hear arguments over a bid by TikTok to stop a likely ban of the app. It and its China-based parent ByteDance are facing a law intended to force a sale of the popular platform, which boasts over 170 million American users. The Justice Department argues that as a Chinese company, TikTok poses, quote, a national security threat of immense depth and scale because of its access to vast troves of user data. Supreme Court justices will be hearing arguments on the matter on January 10th, with the ban looming a little over a week later on January 19th. TikTok on Wednesday said it was pleased the court will take up the issue. In their filing to the Supreme Court, TikTok and ByteDance said that, quote, if Americans duly informed of the alleged risks of COVID content manipulation choose to continue viewing content on TikTok with their eyes wide open, the First Amendment entrusts them with making that choice, free from the government's censorship. The companies asked the Supreme Court on December 16th to pause the law on First Amendment grounds. That came after a lower court in Washington, D.C. rejected those arguments earlier. Congress had passed the measure back in April, and President Joe Biden, a Democrat, signed it into law. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell on Wednesday compared TikTok to, quote, a hardened criminal. He urged the court to reject any delay. However, Republican President-elect Donald Trump, who unsuccessfully tried to ban TikTok during his first term in the White House in 2020, has reversed his stance. In a press briefing Monday, he said,
I have a warm spot in my heart for TikTok.
Trump takes office on January 20th, the day after the TikTok deadline.
Trump has said that he wants to look into a different route with TikTok and its national security risks. He did not go into further detail. Trump previously supported banning the app, but changed his stance partially because he believed that a TikTok ban could drive some TikTok users to Facebook, a platform he has accused of helping his rival, President Biden, during the 2020 election. Also on the Hill, at a hearing on Wednesday, members of Congress are probing China's weaponization of intellectual property, patents, and the legal system. Plus, talk from the business sector about how the Chinese regime's subsidies advance Chinese companies in an unfair way. Let's dive in.
China is actively undermining U.S. leadership by devaluing these patents, directly harming American innovators and weakening their ability to compete globally. There are also national security threats in this situation.
And we find Chinese companies selling the module at a profit for as low as $7.50, whereas a Western company can't build it for under $9. Sans profit. Big question on how that happens without subsidies.
China's government has weaponized its legal system with a wide range of patent and competition law tools, price controls on international entities, forced technology transfers, and by providing selective legal protections and incentives seeking to advantage Chinese companies.
One of the things that happens with U.S. corporations that are not subsidized, when your budget goes down and your returns go down, you reduce your staffing at standards organizations. It doesn't occur with Chinese companies. When they're subsidized, they increase the number of individuals.
The U.S. and its allies consider China's extensive use of subsidies a significant driver of unfair trade competition globally. House Homeland Security Chair Mark Green says the program called the China Initiative may return under the Trump administration. Speaking at a Hudson Institute event, Green warned about Chinese espionage targeting U.S. infrastructure, including port cranes and power plants.
But we're in a conflict with China on multiple levels, and too many people are asleep at the wheel. You look at the crane issue. 80% of cranes manufactured by one company from China. We discover now there are modems on these that can communicate what they see back to China, knowing exactly which military units and aircraft and tanks and jeeps are loaded on which ships. Well, now we know which ship to sink. And this is insanity that we've just allowed this to happen.
The China Initiative was launched during the Trump administration in 2018. It aimed to combat intellectual property theft by the Chinese Communist Party. The Justice Department ended the program in 2022 under Biden administration after allegations of racial profiling. Green also stressed the need for a stronger U.S. cyber response, citing Chinese state-backed hackers that have breached major U.S. telecom networks. He said much of Washington, D.C. remains compromised. Green also emphasized using sanctions and tariffs to address human rights abuses by the CCP. Coming up, the U.S. reportedly considering banning a Chinese internet router over cyber attack concerns. That router is found in millions of Americans' homes and even the office of the Pentagon. More on Beijing's reaction to the news. A strike at chilling crimes in China. The Senate passing a bill aiming to combat the practice of harvesting organs from innocent people while they're still alive. The White House is keeping a closer eye on Beijing and its efforts to silence voices in the U.S. How does the Chinese regime use its economic leverage to influence what U.S. media do and don't say?
There was an example with ESPN when there was that tweet about Hong Kong, and they were being put under pressure in terms of their broadcasts to China that are very lucrative.
That's next after this break. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Wall Street Journal reports that federal authorities are considering a ban on Chinese internet routers. More than half of America relies on routers from a single Chinese company. Even the Department of Defense is among its clients. On Thursday, Beijing responded to the report, accusing the U.S. of targeting Chinese companies. Here are the details.
The Wall Street Journal reports that U.S. authorities are considering a ban on routers from a Chinese manufacturer. According to the journal's unnamed sources, the Departments of Commerce, Defense, and Justice are currently investigating China's TP-Link technology company. NTD cannot independently verify the report. TP-Link routers connect Americans to the internet, and authorities have reportedly expressed concerns over a potential national security risk.
It could be really dangerous. Everything you do on your computer, everything your family does, all the games you play online, all those things that you're doing in your house that is transmitting through the internet could be essentially stolen.
Tech expert Brian Horning says he doesn't know whether the routers are actually a threat, but says it's possible they could be. TP-Link has over 60% of the U.S. router market for homes and small businesses. Even the Defense Department uses them, popular partially because of low prices.
There's vulnerabilities in the firmware of TP-Link routers that could and have given hackers access to the device that it's very hard to detect.
Tony Sabai is a cybersecurity expert at Checkpoint Software Technologies, which has researched TP-Link routers. It's concluded that hackers could have access to them in a way that's very hard to detect. TP-Link says it's fully in line with industry security standards and says it's willing to work with the U.S. government to address security risks.
Efforts to combat the crime of forced organ harvesting. The Senate passed the Falun Gong Protection Act on Wednesday, aimed at deterring the state-sanctioned killing of Falun Gong practitioners for their organs in China.
The bill also passed the House unanimously in June. It would make it U.S. policy to avoid cooperation with China in the organ transplantation field through sanctions, investigating grants, and follow-up reports. Falun Gong is a spiritual meditation practice that's heavily persecuted in China.
Senator Roger Marshall is one of the bill's co-sponsors. He's also a physician. Marshall said in an earlier interview that he's, quote, very aware of this medical tourism, where the biggest challenge right now in America is to get the organ that matches. So people are leaving the country in mass numbers. He added that, quote, we know where a lot of those organs are coming from, a humanitarian crisis situation in China. The Chinese Communist Party has been ramping up its transnational repression. To discuss this and the response from the White House, NTD's Steve Lance sat down with Sarah Cook, author of the Underreported China newsletter.
Sarah Cook, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
Sarah, it's great to have you with us to discuss the Chinese Communist Party's what's perceived to be an increased effort to repress folks in the United States, which is otherwise known as transnational repression, so much so that we literally just saw the White House on Friday launching a new establishment of a China Censorship Monitor and Action Group. Talk to us about what you're seeing here with this. How significant is this?
I think this is quite significant in terms of really the U.S. even more so taking a whole of government approach to responding to what has long been, and for the last several years, an increasing effort by the Chinese Communist Party to influence the U.S. media landscape, to intimidate people in the United States, particularly critics and persecuted minorities who live here in the U.S. And so far, there have been a lot of responses from the executive branch that have been quite important. We've seen indictments from the department and prosecutions from the Department of Justice. But the CCP really takes a whole of society approach when it tries to target a country, especially one that it sees as an adversary like the United States. And so having, in terms of American resilience, a task force that includes not only people from the State Department or the intelligence services, but also departments like agriculture, education, for example, is actually quite important in terms of enhancing our resilience across the board.
To your point, this executive action has actually activated the Central Intelligence Agency, and as you mentioned, going all the way to the Agriculture Department. What types of things do you expect to come out of this? What are they going to be looking at?
So basically, this task force was established because Congress put provisions in a defense bill. And as part of that, they're required in 6 months to issue a report, and then after that, every year. And what that should contain are things related to what's possible that's not confidential and requires security clearance in terms of the various different mechanisms and tactics that the regime might be using to influence the U.S. information environment, engage in censorship, including trying to use economic leverage to make American companies, censor or engage in suppression of information. And this element of transnational repression. So intimidation of people in the United States, whether they're Hong Kongers or Uyghurs or Tibetans or Falun Gong practitioners who are trying to exercise their rights to freedom of expression, freedom of belief, who are often engaged in exposing human rights abuses and crimes that Chinese officials have committed. And what happens here in the U.S. is these people are monitored. Sometimes they're physically attacked. Sometimes they're subjected to cyberbullying. Sometimes they're subjected to all kinds of disinformation and smear campaigns. Their family in China are harassed and threatened to try to silence them here. And I think the idea is that this task force would be both a way to centralize the various reports of these kinds of incidents, as well as to do a better job of integrating and coordinating the response.
You mentioned quite a few things, very interesting, but one of which is when we think, or at least when I do, of transnational repression, usually think about it on the individual level as the Chinese Communist Party attacking dissidents, attacking people from, the Chinese diaspora overseas. But you say that this actually can go to almost the corporate level and beyond just attacking individuals. How so?
So the Chinese Communist Party is very good, and this isn't just in the United States, is very good at establishing economic dependencies and then using that leverage to get local actors in another country to engage in suppression of information, sometimes in propaganda as well, on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. So when I was working at Freedom House, when we were doing research on the Chinese Communist Party's influence on media around the world, we saw a lot of examples of that, where you would have a local official trying to stop a journalistic investigative report about a Chinese mine in Africa. And they're getting a phone call maybe from the Chinese embassy, and they're trying to stop this report from being aired. Even here in the United States, there was an example with ESPN when there was that tweet about Hong Kong, and they were being put under pressure in terms of their broadcasts to China that are very lucrative. And there were leaked internal directives to people at the station to be careful how they talk about Hong Kong politics when they're on the air. So that's the type of influence that's often very hard to gauge and document. But when you talk to people who are working sometimes in these outlets, when you talk to some of the local journalists, or when you occasionally have these kinds of leaks, then you really do see that there are various ways, especially when you get to the higher levels of media companies, owners often with various kinds of economic interests related to China, sometimes editors, and they can be pressured into engaging in suppression. And we see that with corporations as well.
Sarah, of the CCP kind of in the back room pulling the strings, there was a specific, some language in this action from the White House that really stuck out, which was really focusing on the CCP's use of proxies. A lot of times, when we think of proxies, we think of Iran using proxies. We don't really think of the CCP as using proxies, but they're actually the master of it.
Yeah, so I think it gets really tricky here because there can often be lots of different layers. There can be private companies that sometimes get contracted to engage in disinformation campaigns on social media accounts. There can be the Communist Youth League doing all kinds of things, but we don't know that it can come out looking just like trolls, right? There are, various associations in the United States that sometimes have Chinese associations that are on the one hand part of the local community or at universities, but that in fact have ties to the consulates.
Author of the underreported China newsletter, Sarah Cook, thank you for your insights.
Thanks, Dave.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.